Fidel Castro, political leader of Cuba. Fidel Castro's revolutionary career began while he was enrolled at the School of Law of the University of Havana, when he participated in resistance movements in the Dominican Republic and Colombia. Castro began organizing a resistance movement against Cuba's new dictator, leading several ill-fated attempts against Batista's forces, such as the assault on Santiago de Cuba and another on Cuba's eastern coast. The tide of battle would turn, however. Castro's guerrilla warfare campaign and his propaganda efforts succeeded in eroding the power of Batista's military and popular support while also attracting volunteers to the revolutionary cause. Fidel Castro turned Cuba into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. On the one hand, the changes he implemented provided rural areas with electricity, offered free education and health care to all Cubans, and weeded out racism in his country's society. Castro's communist reforms also aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union and alienated it from the United States, a rift that the United States responded to by imposing a trade embargo on Cuba that lasted into the 21st century. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Castro had no choice but to begin accepting some economically liberal policies as a means to keep Cuba's economy afloat. In 1993, a daughter he had out of wedlock while he was a young revolutionary sought asylum in the United States and publicly denounced her father's government. Indeed, Castro's philosophy gravitated toward a Leninist strain of Marxism as his rule progressed, although his beliefs differentiated themselves in some key ways, such as his identification with non-aligned countries and his celebration of guerrilla-style revolution. In the years directly prior to Fidel Castro's retirement, Cuba was undergoing immense changes. Castro sought to offset the ensuing market decline by allowing the implementation of a limited number of economically liberal reforms. Barack Obama and Raúl Castro agreed to reopen diplomatic relations and halt the trade embargo, both of which had been in effect for over 5 decades. Fidel Castro, in full Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz, born August 13, 1926, near Baran, Cuba, died November 25, 2016, Cuba, political leader of Cuba, 1959 to 2008, who transformed his country into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. Together they had 7 children, Fidel was one of them, and Raúl, who later became his brother's chief associate in Cuban affairs, was another. Fidel Castro attended Roman Catholic boarding schools in Santiago de Cuba and then the Catholic High School Belén in Havana, where he proved an accomplished athlete. After his graduation in 1950, Castro began to practice law and became a member of the reformist Cuban People's Party, called Ortodoxos. After legal means failed to dislodge Batista's new dictatorship, Castro began to organize a rebel force for the task in 1953. There Fidel Castro organized Cuban exiles into a revolutionary group called the 26th of July Movement. All of them were killed or captured except Fidel and Raúl Castro, Ernesto, Che Guevara, and 9 others, who retreated into the Sierra Maestra to wage guerrilla warfare against the Batista forces. With the help of growing numbers of revolutionary volunteers throughout the island, Fidel Castro's forces won a string of victories over the Batista government's demoralized and poorly led armed forces. Castro's propaganda efforts proved particularly effective, and as internal political support waned and military defeats multiplied, Batista fled the country on January 1, 1959. Castro's force of 800 guerrillas had defeated the Cuban government's 30,000-man professional army. By the time Urrutia was forced to resign in July 1959, Castro had taken effective political power into his own hands. Castro had come to power with the support of most Cuban city dwellers on the basis of his promises to restore the 1940 Constitution, create an honest administration, reinstate full civil and political liberties, and undertake moderate reforms. The United States was alienated by these policies and offended by Castro's fiery new anti-American rhetoric. In 1960 most economic ties between Cuba and the United States were severed, and the United States broke diplomatic relations with the island country in January 1961. Cuba also began acquiring weapons from the Soviet Union, which soon became the country's chief supporter and trade partner. In 1962, the Soviet Union secretly stationed ballistic missiles in Cuba that could deliver nuclear warheads to American cities, and in the ensuing confrontation with the United States, the world came close to a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended when the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its nuclear weapons from Cuba in exchange for a pledge that the United States would withdraw the nuclear-armed missiles it had stationed in Turkey and no longer seek to overthrow Castro's regime. In the meantime, Castro created a one-party government to exercise dictatorial control over all aspects of Cuba's political, economic, and cultural life. Many members of the Cuban upper and middle classes felt betrayed by these measures and chose to immigrate to the United States. Castro remained premier until 1976, when a new constitution created a National Assembly and Castro became president of that body's State Council. He retained the posts of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and Secretary-General of the Communist Party of Cuba, the only legal political party, and he continued to exercise unquestioned and total control over the government. Castro's brother Raúl, Minister of the Armed Forces, ranked second to him in all government and party posts. Fidel Castro's early attempts to foment Marxist revolutions elsewhere in Latin America foundered, but Cuban troops played an important role in various conflicts in other less developed countries, especially in Africa. It was long held that Cuban forces were acting as surrogates for the Soviet Union in these Cold War conflicts. However, scholarship that emerged in the early 21st century made clear that Cuba had acted at its own behest in Africa as Castro sought to spread the Cuban Revolution internationally and to bolster his standing among non-aligned countries and in the less developed world. From 1975 to 1989, Cuban expeditionary forces fought in the Angolan Civil War on the side of the Communistic Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. By the 1980s, Castro had emerged as one of the leaders of non-aligned countries, despite his ties to the Soviet Union. He continued to signify his willingness to renew diplomatic relations with the United States, provided that it end its trade embargo against Cuba. In 1980, Castro released a flood of immigrants to the United States when he opened the port of Mariel for 5 months. Castro countered the resulting economic decline and shortages of consumer goods by allowing some economic liberalization and free market activities while retaining tight controls over the country's political life. In late 1993, Castro's daughter sought asylum in the United States, where she openly criticized her father's rule. In 2003, the National Assembly confirmed Castro as president for another 5-year term. During that year, the Cuban government arrested dozens of independent journalists and activists in a renewed government crackdown on dissidents, and some 75 activists were convicted for conspiring with the United States to subvert the revolution. On July 31, 2006, Fidel Castro passed power on a provisional basis to his brother Raúl in order to recover from surgery for a serious intestinal illness. In February 2008, just days before the National Assembly was to vote for the country's leader, Fidel Castro, who had not appeared in public for 19 months, officially declared that he would not accept another term as president. In the succeeding months, official photos were released of Fidel Castro in private meetings, and in July 2010 he made a public visit to the National Center for Scientific Research in Havana. In 2011, Fidel stepped down as Secretary General of the Communist Party of Cuba and was succeeded by Raúl.